Tomáš Etzler a vítám vás na dalším debatě Melting Potu. Tato debata bude probíhat v angličtině, takže já rovnou přijdu do angličtiny. Good evening, I am welcoming everybody at yet another debate of Melting Pot, which today we'll be talking about climate change from the point of view what is being done by global organizations, governments, and private companies. We've talked about global warming and climate change before, and we talk to scientists, we talk to journalists who cover the story from different angles from around the world. We talk to grassroots activists and what have you. But today I have a very distinguished guest who has been dealing with the climate change on a little bit different level for a long time. My guest is Dean Rachel Kyte. She is the Dean of Fletcher School at Tufts University in Massachusetts, United States. Prior to that, she was, I'm sorry, I have a long list, I will be brief.
Keep it short.
She was working as a Chief Executive Officer of Sustainable Energy for All. She was, Dean Kyte was also Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Sustainable Energy and Vice President for World Bank's Group for Climate Change. Dean Kyte is also appointed a Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George by the British Queen, and she was recently named of the Times Magazine top 15, or among the Times Magazine top 15 women in the world leading the fight against climate change. Dean Kyte, I really appreciate your time that you can spend with us, and welcome very much to this debate.
No, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
Let me ask you first thing. I've got Fletcher School at Tufts University. I've read that it used to be called Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I also know that Fletcher School is one of the oldest schools in the United States with master's program in international relationship. So my first question is, why a school of diplomacy or international school need, as a dean, a global expert, one of the leading global experts on climate change?
Well, that's a really good question, and perhaps you should ask the trustees that and the president of the university. But if you think about it, the Fletcher School was founded in 1933 at a time when the United States was beginning to look inward. It had been racked by the impact of World War I. It had just emerged. It was living through the Great Depression. And there were political forces that were making it become isolationist again. And there was a feeling by the founder of the school that really the answers were to be found in cooperation and in extending concepts of peace and justice globally. Well, if you fast forward to today and you think about the challenges facing the world, the challenges that threaten to undermine peace and justice, then they are global threats. Climate change is one. Zoonotic pandemic diseases is another. Nuclear proliferation is another. Cyber crimes, terrorism, bioweaponry is another. And so we will need all kinds of global diplomacy to counter the instinct which we've seen in the last few years in a number of countries to turn inward. We have to find global solutions to global problems. And so having a climate diplomat lead the oldest school of diplomacy, I don't think is so strange.
Because you are basically educating the future global leaders and diplomats. And as you mentioned, climate change is, despite, I know it was kind of sidelined now by the terrible pandemic, but it is, and it will remain for a long time, one of the biggest challenges the world is facing today. I want to go back to your engagement with, or to your work for World Bank. Tell me, what is this organization, which is now you are working for the educational institution? What is World Bank? What was your role in there, and what is the role actually of the World Bank? What are they doing to tackle this human challenge, this challenge for humanity?
So the World Bank its role has evolved over the years. It was founded as a result of the Bretton Woods Conference in the United States in the late 1940s, and became part of the international economic architecture. It is a place where all countries come together to offer financial assistance to and lending and policy advice to countries on their growth and the development. Parts of the World Bank Group operate to stimulate the private sector in countries, and other parts of the World Bank Group work on dispute resolution and work to form guarantees to help inward investment. But at the bottom, I think at its core, the mission of the World Bank Group is really about eradicating poverty. In order to eradicate poverty today, one has to attack the twin problems of growing inequality and a lack of inclusion within economies, and the crisis of climate change. And so the World Bank Group now, understands its mission as supporting governments to be able to find paths to greener growth, paths to more inclusion in their economies. And as a result of that, then you can get better healthcare, better education outcomes, better transportation infrastructure, etc. So the bank has evolved over time, but it is held by countries belong to the World Bank. Rich countries own the shares of the World Bank. Borrower countries are able to borrow on very concessional terms, depending on their income levels. I think the really interesting thing about working at the World Bank Group is that you work with thousands of really amazingly qualified and committed people. And so the technical expertise that resides in all of the development banks, the regional ones, as well as the World Bank, is quite extensive.
Can you please explain to us what is the correlation or what is the relationship between eradicating poverty and tackling global warming, the climate change? Is it related at all, or how these two topics are?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, climate change threatens to undermine and roll back the progress that's been made over the last 20 to 30 years in eradicating poverty. So we've seen over the last 20 to 30 years, hundreds of millions of people move out of poverty, in particular in China and parts of South Asia and Asia. And you think about the impacts of climate change today, they fall disproportionately on those who are most vulnerable in society. So those are the poorest and those living in vulnerable situations within developed countries and in developing countries. So it's the populations living in countries that are now racked by extreme weather events, which have just intensified in the last 10, 15 years as a result of climate change. And every time a big storm comes through, it wipes percentage points off your GDP. They may be countries where the rise in temperatures is beginning to affect the agricultural productivity. They might be countries where climate change is leading to political instability because the failing of crops, etc., or insecurity around sea level rise and populations having to move, and therefore driving migration. All of these factors, which their root lies in the impacts of climate change, make countries more unstable, perhaps undermine economic productivity, etc. So we have a real issue that if we want to continue to advance progress in eradicating poverty, then we have to help countries and help people within countries to be resilient. We have to help them be able to adapt to these new climate patterns, weather patterns. And we have to help them build the infrastructure that they need that's going to be the kind of infrastructure we need in a decarbonized world. So more clean energy, more clean transportation, new building patterns and new designs for the new cities of the world, which will be predominantly built in Africa and Asia. So it's very difficult to imagine how we keep making progress on poverty if we don't tackle climate change.
As I mentioned at the beginning, you also work for the United Nations, World Bank, on these topics, global change, global warming, or sustainable development. Are we doing as humanity, with these organizations, with these great big organizations, are we doing enough to tackle this?
No. not at all.
So
I think that so one thing I think that I was honored to work for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and then most recently for Secretary General Guterres. And both of them took climate change very seriously. Both of them completely understood the ramifications of climate change for growth, for development, for peace, for security, for justice. And the job of these organizations is to not only bring countries together so that we can negotiate better pathways forward, but to act as the sort of the conscience and the voice and say, hey, to political leaders, this is top priority. This is what you should be taking care of. And I think both of them did that very well. But at the end of the day, our scientists are being let down by our politicians. The science is clear, and the drumbeat of more and more science coming out, letting us know how dangerous and how fragile the Arctic and the Antarctic are, the two poles, which act almost like a thermostat for the world's weather. How much more we know now about the pace of sea level rise, how much we know now about the impact of climate potentially on nature and on agricultural yield. So these things are coming out every month. There is a report, and our political system, which is oriented around short-term electoral victories, etc., and where many leaders have thought that perhaps there aren't any votes in aggressive action on climate change. Our politics hasn't stayed up to pace with the science. And I think finally, business is actually, for a long time, parts of the business community were a big part of the problem. They were happy with the status quo. They were doing well under the status quo. But more and more, you're starting to see businesses and financiers moving towards a direction of travel where they know in order to be successful over the next 20 to 30 years, they're going to have to show that they can be successful without carbon emissions being part of the economy. And they know that young people increasingly want to work for firms that are purposeful and that know how they're going to play a role in combating climate change. And that so between investors sort of saying, hey, what kind of company are you? How are you going to be successful in a world of climate change? And young people saying, I don't really want to work for a company that doesn't align with my values around climate change. Companies are starting to move ahead, perhaps in some cases, of the politicians.
Let's go back to I want to talk about companies definitely, but I want to ask you about, how these organizations like United Nations or World Bank, how do they convince those countries, to, what you mentioned, how do they talk to these countries? How do they bring these countries on board? How do they convince them, that this is in their interest? Or that's one part of the question. Second part of the question is, are these countries listening? Are actually the leaders of these countries, or at least a percentage of these leaders are receptive to this?
Well, I'll tell you a couple of I'll give you a couple of anecdotes to sort of show how it works as well. But I think that the first thing is to bring it to leaders' attention and say, this is important. You need to be paying attention to this. This is something that you need to act on. And I think both the Secretary General of the United Nations has a very important role to play there. So, with Ban Ki-moon and with Secretary General Guterres, every time they traveled around the world, so they'd be talking to, maybe the Saudi prince about Yemen, and, they talk about that and they say, by the way, on climate change, I need you to do these three things, right? So you bring it in and you make it a priority, and they both do that well and successfully. I think the other thing is that it's not just to say this is important and you need to be paying attention to it. It's also, especially for developing countries, it's like, and here's the evidence and here's the way forward. So it's like, well, so what do you want countries to do? What is the smart thinking about how to move forward? And when I worked at the World Bank, at one point the president of the World Bank was Bob Zoellick, who had formerly been the United States Trade Representative. He was a Republican, and he was a committed multilateralist. And we were trying to get finance ministers, right? I think that you think of the United Nations, its constituency of foreign ministers and presidents around the world. The World Bank's constituency are the finance ministers. And so the finance ministers would gather twice a year at the annual meetings and the spring meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And Bob Zoellick would sit down with the finance ministers with a PowerPoint and would explain to them, what the science was saying about climate change, what the opportunities were and what the different policy options would be, including how to put a price on carbon, for example, effective carbon pricing, other things that they would need to take into consideration, including setting aside finance for adaptation and resilience to the impacts. And, he was acting as a convener. He was bringing them together. He was saying this is a top priority, and then he was actually explaining, and here are the things that you can do. And then, of course, the technical experts in these institutions, whether it's the United Nations Development Programme, United Nations Environment Programme, the Climate Change Secretariat, or the World Bank country teams, they're there as resources then to countries to think through, okay, what's the best pathway? What's the best pathway for our country?
I want to ask you, also, how do you approach these problems? Like you have parts, like Europe, which I think that the or United States, or now when we had a change in the White House, which are I think very well aware of what's happening, and most of the populations that they are trying to do something about it. But then you have countries, such as huge polluters, such as India, such as China, such as Indonesia, where the polluting is kind of course, linked to the level of development. Europe was there was there decades ago, in this very similar situation. How do you balance that? That some countries, are trying to have, electric cars, renewable energy, but then you have this, how do you balance it?
Well, so first of all, within the climate negotiations, there is a concept of common but differentiated responsibilities, which means that everybody has a responsibility to act, but some have a greater responsibility given that they played a greater role in bringing us to this point where we're in a climate crisis. And this, you can imagine, is politically complicated and sensitive. And for many years, there was a posture by middle-income countries and low-income countries that, look, we're not going to do anything because the rich countries have to sort themselves out, and then they have to solve things because they created the problem. And I think that now every country feels the impacts of climate change. For low-income countries, they want to see a transfer of resources, finance and technology and technical support from rich countries and from the countries that cause the problem to them to help them be able to find the pathway forward. But there's no country that's sort of saying, well, I'm not going to do anything now until somebody else has done something first. Every country now is committed to producing plans which should get stronger every 5 years, what we call nationally determined contributions, because it's in everybody's self-interest now to become more resilient to climate change and to find a way to cut emissions. And if you look at China and India, China has made a very clear commitment that it will become carbon neutral in its economy by 2060, what we call net zero emissions. So an economy is in balance with the chemistry of the planet at that time. Everybody is expecting India to make an announcement in the spring of this year at some point that it too plans to be at net zero emissions around about mid-century. The European Union made that commitment last year. The United States has now made that commitment as Joe Biden, when he was running for office, made it as a candidate and has now confirmed that that's what he plans to do as a president. So Japan and South Korea have also said the same thing. So there is now what we call a race to zero. So every country knows that we need by mid-century to have our economy be net zero emissions. And then the question is, how quickly can we make that happen? Because we really need to make big cuts in emissions this decade to give us a chance to get to where we want to be at mid-century. So I think it has evolved, but there is a very clear sense of justice or injustice in climate negotiations, because the countries who are paying the greatest price, who are the most vulnerable, had nothing to do with the cause of the problem. They just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, for example, Pacific Islands. And they feel that the financial flow and the support necessary for them is not adequate yet.
What's interesting when we are talking about this kind of a thing about the developed countries, which are, and yes, the West is largely responsible for the crisis. I was reading very interesting analysis 2 days ago on CNN.com, and they were calling in the 3 countries, Norway, Canada, I don't know if you saw that, Canada and UK as hypocrites when it comes to global change, because they said, yes, they are, all have these kind of programs, no electric cars, renewable energy, and what have you. But for example, all these programs in Norway are financed by exporting fossil fuel. Very similar thing in Canada. So how do you address this? Yes, Norway can have, all the car fleet, electric by, I don't know, 2030 or what have you. But they're part of the problem because they are exporting this.
Yes. So we're at it. We're in the middle of we're in the early stages of what we call the energy transition. So economies are moving away from a fossil-fueled energy system, which then fueled the rest of their economic development, to energy systems which are clean and we hope reliable and affordable, and then that powers greener growth and greener development. And for countries like Norway, where their extraordinary wealth, which is a fairly recent phenomenon, because 50, 60 years ago, Norway was a relatively poor country, but they found oil in the North Sea, and that has led to extraordinary rises in income and living standards, so that Norway is one of the highest rated countries in the world. And Norway is now moving to green development within Norway, but its wealth is still a result of the management of an extraordinary oil fund, a Norwegian national fund. And of course, Norway has continued to invest in the exploitation of fossil fuels. And so now the debate has shifted, and now the question is to countries, okay, it's very good that you have lots of Teslas driving around Oslo, but when will you commit to no more financing of fossil fuel exploitation? And you've seen Denmark make that pledge, right? And when will you make sure that you're not investing in any fossil fuel assets elsewhere in the world? And of course, the Norwegian pension fund has said that it will not invest in a whole list of companies that have lots of interests in oil and gas, because they don't believe that that's a smart investment, a smart risk for the future. So you're starting to see the pendulum shift. And different countries are going at different speeds, but there's an extraordinary pressure on national sovereign funds, on national pension funds, not to invest in the fossil fuel economy, because honestly, that's not where the returns are going to be in the long term. And of course, these are long-term institutional investors. So you're starting to see progress and enormous domestic pressure on these kinds of mechanisms in government. Of course, for Canada, they could become a lot more energy efficient. They've got big investments that they need to make in their energy infrastructure. They've just, now dealing with issues of pipelines. The tar sands business will be declining over the next 10 years. So each of these countries is in its own energy transition.
You mentioned these commitments, these countries are making all these agreements, but is there a way by any organization or anybody to enforce it? Who is going to enforce it? Especially with countries like China, we know that they commit to a lot of things, but then, the reality looks a little bit different. And other countries too. How do you not just control it, but is there any way to enforce it?
So that's an absolutely brilliant question, because there are lots of different sort of theories around this, and we are really in new territory, right? Because there is a convention, and there was a Paris Agreement in 2015, but now embedded in that agreement was what we call this ratcheting mechanism and a bottom-up approach. So rather than negotiating a global treaty that says, you must do this, you must do that, you must do that, and the treaty holds you accountable, the countries are being held accountable, but for voluntary national determined contributions. So every country presents a plan of how it thinks it will achieve the target embedded in the Paris Agreement. And of course, what is the accountability mechanism on that? Well, it's really name and shame, and it's name and shame from the international community. It's name and shame domestically from people especially young people, demanding that they have a clean air and good jobs that come from
clean energy investments, etc., etc. And it comes from investors who are saying, wait a minute, I don't want to be investing in things which are heavily carbon intensive, because I'm not going to get a return on my investment in a world where we are decarbonizing. So it's a very multifaceted way of holding people accountable for staying on track. And of course, we're not on track at the moment. But you're also seeing some other things happening. Agenda, an incredible NGO in the Netherlands, led a charge and sued the Dutch government for not protecting the health of Dutch people by not having an ambitious enough climate change policy. They won after many appeals and going to the Supreme Court, etc. Something very similar to that just happened in France. And there are hundreds of legal claims now around the world as people are saying, look, I'm not being protected by the state if the state doesn't have an ambitious climate plan. And I think the final thing I would say is that there's some very interesting ideas coming out now, for example, to treat oil or to treat fossil fuel resources the way we would have treated nuclear weapons 20 or 30 years ago. And so there is now some innovative work around a register of all of the known and proven reserves of oil around the world and coal around the world, which if they are dug up and if they are burnt, will take us past where we need to be under the Paris Agreement. And some of the people working on what we're calling a global registry hope that one day perhaps there should be a fossil fuel non-proliferation agreement. So there's some new interesting ways to think about a problem of, we have these reserves, we can't exploit them, how do we make sure we do not exploit them?
I want to go back to, we mentioned, both of us, you mentioned these two words, FF, fossil fuel. Is this the main culprit in global warming?
Yes, by any measure. So fossil fuels in the energy system, and then the heavy dependence upon fossil fuels in manufacturing, in heavy industry, in aviation, in shipping, steel, cement, etc., and in transportation. There are also short-lived climate pollutants, and these are very dangerous because carbon dioxide, when it goes up into the atmosphere, can stay there for decades and decades and decades. There are a number of things which accelerate climate change. They go up, but they don't stay very long there, but they accelerate. And those include black carbon, which is soot to you or me, hydrofluorocarbons, which are refrigerants, and then, of course, methane, which leaks from the gas infrastructure in the world, leaks from melting permafrost, and also is flared and burned when the gas industry doesn't actually doesn't cap the flaring that it might occur in its operations. This is an accelerant as well. So given that we have to make so much progress this decade, we should be focused on carbon dioxide, but we have to be also focused on these other chemicals and other what we call super pollutants. But most of them find their origin in carbon and find their origin in fossil fuels as well.
We were talking about the countries a little bit. I want to ask about the companies. Actually, before I go there, I asked you if we are doing enough against the global warming. Your response was no. Do you think that the world is ready to kind of enter this kind of a post-fossil? I mean, after post-fossil fuel, reality and world?
Well, I think enough people understand the science, and enough people know that we've got to act, and we've got to act now. And there is, especially with the election of President Biden, there is now an alignment that we haven't seen before at the sort of global level. So from China to the EU to the US to Japan to South Korea to a number of countries in Latin America, a number of countries in Africa. We have key players understanding that this is an urgent priority and an existential threat. The question is, can we move fast enough? Can they receive the political support they need to make some deep cuts and some changes? We're talking about pivoting We're talking about not sacrificing and going into a sort of deep, dark world in the future where we won't have all the things that we aspire to. We're talking about using technology, using all of our financial resources to quickly move to cleaner energy technologies and cleaner technologies, a better treatment of nature, a better way of farming, etc. And if we do that, then we could stabilize the world's climate system. But if we do that, there's all the evidence is that there are good jobs. There is a growing, there could be growing income levels. We could make the world more equal. It doesn't have to be a story of having to give up a lot. It could be actually a story of finding all kinds of things that we'd forgotten about or that we need.
Do we have the technologies to make this move?
We have most of the technologies. There are technologies that need to improve. You're beginning to see, for example, the emergence of a green hydrogen economy. There are about 2 or 3 technologies in pilot phase on how to make steel without burning fossil fuels. We have new technologies potentially in turning carbon dioxide into things that we need. So capturing emissions and making building products from carbon dioxide. We know how to capture emissions and then grow algae and sort of have closed loop systems that help with agriculture. So we have the pace of technological innovation is extraordinary. Also using machine learning and artificial intelligence to better predict where storm damage will come, who's most at risk, using blockchain to secure carbon credits if you're in one side of the world and you're buying solar power from the other side of the world. So we have a lot. There are things that we still need. I think what we call direct air capture, so mechanisms for taking carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering it. I think there's a lot of people believe that there are new generations of nuclear power available to us, which could be safe. That technology continues to be the subject of great innovation as well. But I think what we do also need is more public investment in R&D, research and development, for the things that poor people use. So including the food that poor people eat. I mean, most of the agricultural research today goes into just 3 staples, into maize, into wheat, and to rice. We have to do much more research into how to grow the crops that poor people eat in the weather conditions and the climate conditions that they're likely to experience in the next 10 to 20 years. So how do you grow peanuts and groundnuts, in just 30 days so that they are resistant to extreme heat and resistant to drought? How do you grow rice when you're completely underwater because the rain patterns have changed? How do you grow rice where there is no water? So these are the things that we need to see more of.
Tell me, what do you see? Because before all these, organizations, you also worked in the private sector. What do you see in the private sector? How is private sector preparing for actually doing to tackle the climate change and preparing for this post-carbon world?
Well, I think that in the sectors of industry which have been the culprits, as it were, they were the proud big companies of the fossil fuel economy. So oil and gas companies, coal mining companies, mineral companies, big heavy industry companies. They are really moving very, very fast in most cases. Private companies are, international companies, to working out how they are going to continue to be profitable and how they're going to be in business in a world where the goal is to decarbonize. And so you're starting to see leading oil and gas companies talk not just about becoming more efficient in their management of energy through the life cycle of their products, but you're actually starting to see oil and gas companies saying we will be exploiting less oil and gas, right? So that's existential for an oil and gas company if you're going to be moving away from oil and gas. And it's a very fast moving. Last year, British Petroleum came out with some very ambitious targets for itself. They're committing to science-based targets, committing to net zero. This year, Shell has come out with something equally, if not exactly the same in terms of ambition. But of course, within the oil and gas sector, then you have listed companies in the West, such as Exxon, and that have still a very different view that this is not so serious, that they don't need to make those kinds of commitments. And of course, listed international major oil and gas companies only account for 20% of the oil and gas exploitation in the world. 80% is with national oil companies in developing countries and in middle income countries, and they are not moving in the same direction. In heavy industry, there are steel companies working out how to make steel without carbon. There are cement companies working out how to make cement without carbon emissions. So in every sector of heavy industry, what we call the hard to abate sectors, there is a leading edge of innovators. Within the shipping industry, the same. There's a coalition now of companies and ports and fuel companies looking at zero emissions vessels by 2030. And of course, the aviation sector, which has been hit so hard by the pandemic, also is under extreme pressure to become an industry that can operate with zero emissions as well, or zero net emissions. And then there's the exciting stuff, which is all the companies involved in the transition. So all of the clean energy companies, all of the new technologies, all of the electromobility companies, all the car companies now, almost every major car company has a commitment about weaning its way away from the internal combustion engine. Just this week, Ford Motor Company said that it won't be building any more in internal combustion engines, by the latter half of this decade. So that transition is really fast underway. Now, what we need to do is to make sure that we don't just export all of our internal combustion engine cars down to the poorer countries of the world. That won't help the planet. It might help country A in Europe have a greater emissions profile, but it doesn't help if those are simply being used elsewhere. So we're going to need a huge global, what we call cash for clunkers program, so that those old internal combustion cars are not being used anywhere, and that access to clean mobility technologies is equal in developing countries and developed. So I think that there's a lot happening in the private sector where the leading edge is really right there. What you need public policy for then is to regulate so that every company has to move quickly in the right direction.
Tell me, what does it take for these big companies, some of them you mentioned, to change, to kind of adapt to it? How do they convince their shareholders? How, because the companies are still here to make money. What does it take? What do they need to make this change?
So I think that really the sort of breakthrough analysis was the concept of stranded assets, which was really first put forward about 6-7 years ago. And this is the concept that in a world where we need less carbon in the economy, and we actually have to zero out carbon emissions in the global economy, if you're holding carbon, or if you're in a business which is dependent upon carbon or is very carbon intensive, at some point, your assets are going to be of no value. And at some point, you're going to be stranded. And so this was a very important concept in the financial sector, because it meant that banks, insurance companies, institutional investors, asset owners, asset managers didn't want to hold companies whose business is really carbon intensive. So they didn't want to have lots of carbon in their portfolios. And so they started then asking lots of questions. And then they started sort of saying, look, can you show us how you're going to be successful? So can you commit to a science-based target that shows that you'll be able to operate your business under the Paris conditions? And this really had a huge impact. And then you had, at the same time, really radical movements from young people, from students, and then in the United Kingdom, from Extinction Rebellion and others, who really were putting pressure to divest. So they wanted, people to say, we will not finance anymore, we will not invest anymore in fossil fuels, or companies involved in the fossil fuel sector. And that's had an extraordinary success as well in just a few years, where you've got hundreds of trillions of dollars now not wanting to be invested in these things. And it became a global movement as well. And then public money said, no, we will. So most European governments themselves, bilaterally and through multilateral development banks, have basically stopped public aid money or public assistance to other countries being used for fossil fuel energy infrastructure, for example. So the pressure really has come on companies from their financiers, from their shareholders, from their banks, as well as then from their customers in some cases.
But it also comes down to the leadership of the companies, doesn't it? Because, you know, in my line of work, you know, I've done, you know, a lot of profiles recently about companies, and there is this whole global movement, you know, in Europe and in the United States, in Asia, you know, called impact investment, you know, where some of the big companies, including, like, for example, ABB, I did some work with, they told me we cannot even hire, you know, young people today if we wouldn't have programs which are addressing these issues. And I also noticed it was fascinating to see that this whole mentality kind of approach of the leadership of the CEOs who are, let's say, 50, 60 plus, and the CEOs who are 30, 35 plus. There's a major difference. So the leadership also plays, I guess, a very big role in this.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And you think about, you know, sort of, CEOs who, and I think it's true, there's a generational shift, but CEOs sort of saying, this is important to the company, these are our values, we're a purpose-driven company, this is what it means. And they have an eye on their employees and employee pressure. They have an eye on future employees for sure. And they have an eye on their investors, but it is about their own personal ethic. And so I think of Paul Pullman, I think of ABB, think of Schneider Electric, think of Enel, Engie, the big European utilities, Iberdrola, and even in the oil and gas sector, Bernard Looney, who came in as the new CEO of BP, came out with a very, very different sort of tone and message about the future of that company. And I think it's also true in some of the finance firms as well, although I think, you know, some of the financial firms have also got, you know, other issues of social and governance ethics associated with them. But yeah, I think it really does tone at the top, and the leadership at the top is very important.
How can the financial sector help in it? You know, you know, like you mentioned, what is their role? You know, the role of the banks and investment companies. Especially in this changing world, you know, if we are going really to shift from fossil fuel to renewable energies?
Well, I think actually one of the fastest moving parts of the whole puzzle has been what central banks think about climate change and what they are now doing. And this started just a few years ago when Mark Carney, who was then the head of the Bank of England, gave a sort of fairly famous speech where he talked about the horizon, and he talked about he talked about the tragedy of the horizon. And what he was really talking about there was the sort of the inability of the system to see what was coming and to move towards it. And he started together with bankers from the Bank of France, from the Netherlands Central Bank and elsewhere, a group of central banks really looking at systemic risk as a result of stranded assets, as a result of the need to decarbonize. And so what you've seen is a number of central banks now more and more working together in something called the NGFS, which is a network of central banks around the world. And what they're doing is looking at what are the mechanisms that they can use to try to sort of stress test the financial sector to make sure that it can be resilient to a collapse in price of companies that are holding carbon when carbon has no value, and the banking system that banks those companies. And so you're starting to see stress testing. And for example, in the Bank of England are going to ask every bank that does business in the UK to stress test its portfolio to make sure that it isn't at risk from stranded assets. Now, with Janet Yellen having been appointed as the Secretary of the Treasury in the US, we will also start to see now in the United States, which has been running a little bit behind, some coordination across the financial system of the United States, also looking at the risk to the financial system, but also looking at the opportunities of the financial system if it were to put a premium on investing in green. And then finally, the European Central Bank. Now, this is very interesting because under Christine Lagarde's leadership, and of course, she did much to start talking about climate change when she was the head of the International Monetary Fund. But the European Central Bank has started to indicate that if the goal is to sort of zero out carbon emissions from the global economy over the next 30 years, then maybe, as the European Central Bank, it would prefer to see green assets or green bonds over brown bonds. That maybe it shouldn't be neutral, and it shouldn't have a neutral view of the market. It should hold a preference for a shift to investment in green. Now, if it were to do that, then you would start to see more and more and more investments flowing into the green sector. We've already seen an explosion in green bonds in the last sort of 6 to 7 years. I remember, I think in the run up to Paris, the size of the green bond market was, I think, 40 billion in 1 year, and now it's hundreds and hundreds of billions, and so if not trillions. And so things are moving actually quite fast, but that's because many central bank governors in key economies understand that there is a macro critical or a systemic risk from not managing the process of decarbonisation smoothly.
You know, I've got a question, because when I'm listening to, I'm becoming very optimistic in a sense, you know, that it seems that everybody's on board, everybody knows what's going on, everybody, you know, like organizations, countries, governments, private sector, banking, you know, but if you look at the, you know, for example, the Paris Agreement, one part of the agreement is that the goal is to limit warming of the planet to 2 degrees Celsius, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius prior to pre-industrial levels. And that would demand a decrease of fossil fuels by 6% every year. However, you know, if they want to reach it by 2030 or whatever that year is, 2030, yes. And but at this moment, it's still growing. They're supposed to lower it by 6% every year, the dependency on fossil fuel. But what I was reading, it's growing by 2%. So what else does it take, you know, to really meet these targets?
No, so you're right. And as I said earlier, we are absolutely not on track. But I think what I'm describing is in response to the fact that we're coming up against the boundaries of our planetary existence, right? We're crossing planetary boundaries at the moment. We've got too much pollution and waste. We've got a crisis of biodiversity and nature, and a crisis of carbon emissions and climate change. That in response to that, we are coming up against tipping points in the positive. You know, the number of countries that are setting the right kinds of targets, the amount of finance that is, you know, not going to invest in the bad stuff anymore, and things like this. So I'm trying to describe, I think, that there is a lot beginning to happen, and I regard the greatest enemy that we've had for the last few years to have been incumbency and inertia. Inertia in that, you know, it's just really hard to dismantle systems and build new ones. It takes time, and we haven't had all of the right players in the right position, and we haven't expressed the urgency, and we haven't had the political leadership we need. And then incumbency in that it isn't just that, you know, we come with the science and the evidence, and we come with great ideas, and okay, well, we can do that. We've got incumbents, we've got actors who are doing very well, thank you, from a fossil fuel based economy that is dangerous to us, and they fight tooth and nail. They fight with extraordinary amounts of money to slow down and to stop progress. And so if incumbency and inertia are our two greatest enemies, I am optimistic about the gathering sort of momentum now within the financial markets, amongst financial leaders, amongst business leaders, amongst mayors and municipal leaders, that there is a pathway forward, and that they understand the energy transition and they understand the urgency. I'm less optimistic when I look around the world and think, you know, who are the extraordinarily courageous political leaders who at the national level are prepared to just put out that no. So people are excited by all of the mood music in Washington and by what Joe Biden and his team are now saying. And the proof will be in the pudding, as we say in English, right? But we need that kind of sort of to be expressed by political leaders in every other part of the world. Of course, we've got a lot of leaders of smaller countries that have done all the right things and said all the right things, from Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand to Mary Frederickson in Denmark to the leaders of Costa Rica, Chile. There are small countries doing great things. In Kenya, they've extended energy access from 20 to 50% of the population in just 20 years. And they've done that by embracing renewable energy. So, there are transformations. Look at Morocco, the heart of concentrated solar power. They can produce enough concentrated solar power for all of their neighbors in North Africa, and they could export it over the Mediterranean to the EU if we could get our act together. So that's what gives you hope, I think. But we're not there yet.
And another part of that hope is what you already mentioned, some of this, and I don't really like lawsuits, but I was really amazed, for example, by this whole movement, which was starting and inspired by Greta Thunberg. And, there was a very recently, I think the lawsuit came from Portugal, from high school students who actually sued the governments of European Union and other European countries. And they won this, and now the countries have to, because they were basically suing you are destroying our future.
Yeah.
So I think that I'm very sad that Greta Thunberg is creating so much controversies, but I really admire her for really kind of fueling this or bringing this issue to the forefront of young people. It's like when I, for example, go to a store and pick up a plastic bag, my daughter, who is 12 years old, she's killing me with her eyes. So I think that this movement of young people also, they will be pushing their governments, I hope, and that pressure will lead to something.
Yeah, I think so. I think it already had an effect, especially in Europe, but elsewhere in the world. And I think what's it's difficult to look away from these young people, because they're not sort of taking a militant view in terms of, we want to overthrow government, we want to take on the role of government. They're very clear, like, no, you're the government, we want you to do your job and we want you to do it better. And many of these young people also say to government, why don't you just tell the truth? And I think this is extremely powerful, because governments know, they've seen the science, they've been briefed on the science, they know what's going to be easy, what's going to be more difficult. They know where the costs are going to have to be incurred in the short run. They know where the benefits will arrive in the long run. And these young people are saying, look, come clean, tell the populations what's at stake. And maybe if you do, then we have a chance to mobilize populations much more broadly than even now in response, and let people, be part of the solution. And I think that is powerful, and I've seen it have a powerful effect on individual leaders.
Thank you. I will ask. There is a question from James from Canterbury, from United Kingdom. Has COVID affected our climate? How does this whole COVID situation with these disruptions in industries and whatever, how does it affect the climate or the fight or the struggle to tackle it?
So that's a really great question, James. So in the early stage of the lockdown in the West, right? So in Northwest Europe, North America, etc., we saw a remarkable plummet in the use of energy. And as a result, a remarkable decline. I mean, a really steep curve down in terms of emissions. And so in sort of mid-March, late March, April, the emissions reduction was quite extraordinary. And at that moment, there was a sort of all this kind of euphoria about, maybe this is it. We get to cut emissions. But of course, even though nobody would have wished it to be on the back of a pandemic, of course, as the countries started to open up again at the end of the first wave, emissions just went up again as well. In some cases, they went up even faster. But it gave us a window into what is possible. I'm not saying that we should all just stop flying, but we do know that nature comes back into cities when everybody's not driving around in the car all the time. And I think that it may have slightly reset our relationship with our lives and with possibilities. So there's a number of cities that are changing their sort of greening patterns as a result of the pandemic. But going forward, I think what the pandemic has done is that while for sure there is an extraordinarily negative economic impact on many, many, many countries as they've had to seek to keep people employed, to support their economies, support businesses as everything was locked down. There has also been very clearly a signal from the private sector that they want more and more and more what we call ESG stocks. So they're interested in companies that can perform well environmentally, perform well socially, perform well in governance. And so the private sector has not sort of said, oh, well, you know, here's a COVID pandemic, you know, we can't afford to change and we can't afford to move on this growth towards greener growth. Therefore, we go back and invest in oil stocks, etc. The private sector and private investors have just doubled down on this move away from fossil fuels. So we're at a moment now where the recovery packages from government, so public sector spending, could actually be used to pivot towards greener growth. If you're going to be spending money, printing money for some rich countries in recovery packages, then there is the new better jobs for the future are going to be in refurbishing buildings and making them more energy efficient, the e-mobility infrastructure that's needed if we're all going to drive electric cars, and also renewable energy rather than coal or oil. Now, unfortunately, from the analysis of Vivid Economics and other think tanks, most of the recovery packages, with the exception of the European Union, are mainly brown, not green. And that's going to be a huge, huge, huge missed opportunity, because it's very rare in our economic history that we pump this kind of money into the global economy in order to recover. So if you're going to do it, you want to do it for green outcomes. But that's why 2021 is going to be so important, as well as interesting, is can we actually rectify that? And can we use this crisis as an opportunity?
Lucia is asking pretty much the same question I asked you when we were preparing for this. Rachel, are you an optimist or are you scared of the future, and why?
Yeah, I'm a hopeful pessimist. Pessimist in that the science is truly terrifying, and I do believe. I think Noah Harari said that our scientists were being let down by politicians, and I agree with him. But I am an optimist because I've seen things move very quickly, and I've seen people change their minds, and I've seen firms pivot, and I've seen countries pivot. And so I don't think this is beyond our capability. And I believe young people see that very clearly. And so for that reason, I'm hopeful.
Rachel, thank you very much. I think that was a nice ending. I really thank you for your time. And,
well, thank you for so many great questions. This was a really good conversation.
I hope that we will have this discussion in the future again. And I hope that when we have it, you can confirm that your optimism about 2021 and the opportunities this year and the pandemic is offering in this field will materialize. Thank you very much again.
Well, and thank you so much.
And I thank you all our viewers, and we'll see you also in one of the next discussions of Melting Pot. Thank you very much and have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Good evening.
Thank you.